Well, to make my point today, I decided I would tell you 3 very short true stories. The first one, I'm sure you read about in the newspaper. It happened several years ago, quite a few years ago actually. Mrs. Maria Rubio of Lake Arthur, New Mexico, was making her husband breakfast one morning. She was making tortillas when suddenly something happened that took her breath away. She looked down at her flat tortilla, and there suddenly appeared the face of Jesus. Suddenly, she realized that the skillet had burned into a perfect representation of a slender, bearded face on the surface of the bread. Now, exactly how she realized that this was the face of Jesus, I'm not quite certain. But she convinced a very reluctant priest who actually came and blessed the bread. After that, Maria quit her full-time job, and she built a shrine for the tortilla. And if you Google it on the internet, you can still find the shrine for the tortilla Jesus that exists in Lake Arthur, New Mexico. Now, you no longer can see the face. I think it was 1977 that this happened. And so as you can imagine, a tortilla eventually does deteriorate. But Mrs. Rubio still prays nightly, right in front of the tortilla. And she says, I don't know why this has happened to me, but God has come into my life through this tortilla. Now, Faye Neff tells a story about a little girl named Wendy, who was also always fascinated by a certain feature in her church. Behind the pulpit was a wooden door. It wasn't a regular-sized wooden door. It was a little bit smaller, but it never opened. And Wendy was absolutely certain that Jesus lived behind that door. She knew that, and she took great comfort in that. She knew that the priest would every once in a while would go in that door. And she figured he went in to talk to Jesus, and that Jesus would tell him what he should preach about that day, and then he would come out. Now, Wendy would never have knocked on the door by herself, but one day, the door was open, and she wondered what she should do. But no one was around, and so she took a deep breath, and she walked into the door. But all she saw were musty choir robes and old Christmas church decorations. Jesus wasn't there. And in her childish mind, Wendy wondered if Jesus had left her church for some reason or another. Because if Jesus wasn't in her church, where was he? The third story. Martha Wade is a Bible translator. And she chose to live her life in one of the most remote, difficult places on earth, in a jungle village in Papua New Guinea. And she spent her life translating the Bible for the villagers. Now, if you've ever tried Bible translation, I can tell you that it is a painstaking job, especially when their native language is not your own. And so she was spending years and years at this task. And one time she had finished just a section of the Gospels. And she gave it to one of the elders of the village. And after reading it, he remarked, "Now I know that God speaks our language." And he was thrilled. Mrs. Rubio saw the face of Jesus in a tortilla. A little girl looked for Jesus in her church. A village elder rejoiced that God speaks his language. All of us yearn to see God. All of us want to see God. We want to know that God is with us, that God knows us, that God understands us, that God helps us, especially when we're really hurting. We really need and want to know that. St. Augustine once posed the following experiment. He said, imagine God saying to you, "I'll make a deal with you if you wish. I will give you anything and everything that you want. Pleasure, power, wealth, freedom, even peace of mind and a good conscience. Nothing will be a sin, Nothing will be forbidden, and nothing will be impossible for you. You'll never be bored, nor will you die. Only one thing. You will never see my face. Now, St. Augustine said that first part is really appealing to us. There's a part of us all that is a pleasure-loving part, a part that perks up at the thought of guiltless, endless delight. But then, just as we're about to raise our hand and say that we're in the deal, we think about that last phrase. But you will never see my face. You see, you and I yearn to see the face of God. It's natural. It's natural for us, once we know God, that we want to see God. We are instant people. We want to know that what we believe in is real. And the way we know it's real is if we can touch it, if we can see it, if we can feel it. We all want to find and see. We may not look for him in tortillas, but we would like to know that there is a special room in this church where God lives. We are glad to know that God speaks our language. And we know that although we have a world full of beguiling pleasures, they're not enough. We still would give it all up if we could really see God. If so did the people who came to see Jesus. They knew that he was doing miracles. They knew that strange things were happening. They knew that there was something about this man, and they wanted to see him, and they followed him. But their hearts were still yearning for more. They wanted the Messiah. They wanted to know that there is a loving God who rules over creation. In one of the Chicken Soup for the Souls books, there's a story about a doctor who had a 5-year-old patient named Mary. Now, Mary had suffered a stroke at 5, which left her paralyzed on one side of her body. And then after that, she developed a brain tumor, and both her mother and her father died. The doctor had brought the little girl in to have an MRI, and they placed her in the machine. And at that time, when you went into an MRI, you had to remain perfectly still for at least 5 minutes. And they had explained that to Mary. About 2 minutes into the first sequence, they could see Mary's mouth moving. And so very gently, the technician and the doctor said to her, "Mary, we told you that you cannot talk." And she smiled and she said, "Okay, I won't talk." And then they began again, and the same thing happened. 2 minutes into the sequence, they could see her mouth moving, and they could just barely hear something that she was saying. This time the technologist got a little bit gruff, and he said, "Mary, you were talking again, and that causes blurry pictures." And she said, "I wasn't talking, I was singing." And he said, "What were you singing?" She said, "You said I couldn't talk, but you didn't say I couldn't sing." And he said, "What were you singing?" And she said, "I was singing Jesus Loves Me. I always sing Jesus Loves Me when I'm happy." And the doctor and the technologist had to leave the room, thinking that a 5-year-old who'd been through all that was happy as she had her MRI singing Jesus Loves Me. She wanted to know Jesus, and she knew that Jesus loved her. We yearn, as the people of God, to see God, to hear Jesus, and to hear him teach and preach, and that's what the people back then were doing. They were following him. They had the law, they had the prophets, they had what they needed, but they needed the Messiah, and so they followed him everywhere he went. They needed a bridge to God, so that they could believe as they went through their lives, because lives are full of ups and downs and horrible things and wonderful things. And Jesus said to them, "I am the bread of life. Those who come to me will not hunger, and those who believe in me will never thirst." One more story, and I tell this because I did not do this, and I had the chance to do this, and I blew it. Steve Winger of Lubbock, Texas, was taking his final exam in logic. And this professor was famous for the most difficult final exams that ever could be. But he said to them, as my professor in Greek did, "You may bring in one sheet of paper, and you may put on that paper everything that you possibly can that you think will help you for this exam." And so all the students, everything that you can fit on one piece of paper. So all the students went home, and I could still show you my Greek card because I found it the other day. I was only allowed 5 by 8, but I had more things on that card and 3 magnifying glasses so I could see it. That's how tiny I had written it all. So all these students bring in 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper full of information for their logic exam, except for one student who came in with an empty 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper and an advanced logic student. He put the piece of paper on the floor, and the advanced logic student stood on top of the paper and whispered into the student's ear everything that he needed to know. He was the only one in the class that got an A. Would you rather walk into a difficult exam with a piece of paper or with a living, breathing expert? You see, Jesus is the living, breathing expert that can get us through this exam that we call life. This exam that brings so much to us. This exam that brings us those incredible highs and those devastating lows in our lives. The people of Jesus' time could hear him. They could see him. They could physically touch him. We read those stories and we yearn to see him. We yearn to touch him. St. Augustine, in his book, The Confessions, said, "God was inside of me, but I was outside myself." And that's how we missed each other. Luckily for St. Augustine, he did find his way back into himself, and he did meet God there. My prayer for you and for me is that we may be able to stay inside ourselves and to meet the living, breathing God who fills us with life. For Jesus said, "I am the bread of life. All who come to me will never be hungry, and all who believe in me will never thirst." So come to the table and be fed. Amen.